Hey guys, this episode is going to be a little bit different than I normally do. I spoke with Timon Cline and we had such a great time talking about a variety of issues that we ended up recording quite a long episode. So I'm breaking this episode out into two different parts. There'll be a part one and part two. You're about to listen to part one of my conversation with Timon Cline. So make sure you subscribe and stay tuned for part two, which will drop a week later. And if you're not subscribed or signed up yet, I would encourage you to go to Patreon and sign up there. It's a great way to help support the podcast and keep bringing great content to you, like interviews with Neil Shinvey, Megan Basham, Josh Dawes, all these fantastic people. I want to keep doing that, and so I'd love your help in doing that. So click the link in the episode show notes for my Patreon and sign up there at any amount. Anything helps, and I'd love to have you partner with me in that way. With that said, here's my interview, first half with Timon Cline. Well, hey, and welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. It's good to be with you, and I am glad to have my guest, Timon Cline, here on the show. I'm not going to give Timon a huge intro or anything like that because I actually want to hear more of his story, hear kind of his deal and what he's about. It is Timon, right?
That's right. Yeah. Not Timon, not Timon. I don't know. There's multiple variations I get.
Is it like a 50-50 chance that somebody gets it right?
Not even 50-50.
Really?
Yeah, like 5%.
Oh man, that stinks.
Get it right, but
what kind of?
It's in the Bible. Just so everyone knows, it's in Acts 6.
Oh,
anyone who doesn't know that just proves you don't know your deacons. You know,
man.
So it's the deacons list. But yeah, and then there's the one Shakespeare play that's Timon of Athens. No one reads it. It's like roundly regarded as his worst play. So
great.
There's that. He was a Stoic philosopher.
Man, congratulations.
Yes. John Owen actually quotes him one time.
Hey, there you go.
Biblical theology. Yeah. So
that's great.
Claim to fame.
My first name is Joshua, if my listeners don't know. And
actually did not know that.
So yeah, that's why I go by J. Chase Davis on my book and other places.
Yeah.
My mom and dad always called me Chase since, I was one. But Joshua is a really fun name because you got, Joshua in the Bible is kind of legit.
Yeah, he's based.
People, yeah, for sure. But people always shorten it to Josh, and I'm like, no, it's first of all, it's Chase. Second, it's Joshua. Like, just do the whole thing. Well, Timon,
I have a nephew like that his name is Benjamin, and I call him Ben all the time just to annoy my sister-in-law because it's like it's Benjamin.
That's great. I started following Timon, I guess, when COVID hit, I got back on Twitter. And I was looking for accounts that made sense, not just like accounts that like I agree with, but accounts that were pushing me to think deeply about what was going on in the world. And I don't know who retweeted you or how I stumbled upon you. The Twitter gods kind of revealed your presence. And I started reading what you were putting out, and I was like, this guy is thinking about some stuff that I really enjoy. So I'd love to kind of hear more of your story. You're a lawyer by trade, is that right?
That's right. Yeah. Practice law in New Jersey right now.
And what kind of law do you practice?
So I obviously only caveat, I represent myself, but so I'm a deputy attorney general in New Jersey, and my practice area right now is in family law. Okay. So the biggest agency in the state, as it is with many states, is the Department of Children and Families, and so that's the type of law I've been practicing for about a year now, I guess. So weird spot to end up, but it's very interesting. So I live in Philadelphia, practice in New Jersey. I went to Rutgers for law school and Westminster for seminary in this area. So that's why we've lived out. Me and my wife Rachel have lived out here for I guess 6 years or going on 7. So we came out for school, and I did both of those concurrently, so it was about 5 years to finish both of them up. So yeah, that's why we're out here and what I do.
What did you do at Westminster?
So I did the MAR at Westminster, which is basically MDiv without pastoral courses. So I wanted to at Westminster, there's lots of schools that have alternatives to like the MDiv that were always just not appealing to me. They're like 30 hours or whatever.
Right.
At Westminster, you still have to do the languages and all the systematics, and most appealing to me was church history. So I used most of my time and a lot of independent studies doing that. And I went there not only because it was close and available Reformed seminary, but for because Carl Truman was still there at the time. He was my
Oh, wow.
advisor. And then after he left midway through, Chadman Dixhorn was my advisor, and now I still kind of do stuff for him now at the Craig Center at Westminster. I'm a research fellow this year. So yeah, that's Westminster is a great place. Highly recommend. Westminster, the real one in Philadelphia, not the fake one.
Right, I agree.
And Escondido, yeah, that one.
Did you have Vern Poitras for anything or no?
I did, yeah. I had him for hermeneutics.
That's great. I
He
want to
was
have him on my
teaching
podcast.
Greg. Oh, he'd be great. Greg Beale had just was either leaving or had left, and he had typically taught hermeneutics at least once a year. So I ended up with Vern Poitras, which he's just fascinating as a person. With the mathematics background, and then moves into his multiple doctorates, all that kind of thing. A lot of the older guys at Westminster that are kind of phasing out, him and oh gosh, I'm gonna forget the names now, but a lot of those guys, I mean, they're just very learned people generally. William Edgar, that's who I was thinking of. Just such a learned person. So it's sad that a lot of them are getting older, but there's a lot of new talent, I guess you might say. It's coming in. Todd Rester and lots of other guys they've hired recently. So it's in a good place.
Yeah, I think Brian Matson teaches out there sometimes, and I've had him on the podcast.
Oh, does he?
Before.
Okay.
Yeah, or at least just affiliated in some way.
Yeah.
But
so
yeah,
Mark Jones would be another one. Mark Jones is fantastic on the Puritans. Aaron Denlinger, who's actually in Colorado, I can't remember where. Great scholar of Scottish Reformation, and teaches at a classical school in Colorado. I can't remember. I don't think he's in Boulder, but somewhere else. But a lot of the people in the Westminster orbit, are really good, and it's a great. It was a very much an intellectually stimulating time for me, and especially doing both. Kind of as soon as I would get tired of one, would kind of transition back to the other, or take some in the same semester. And I don't recommend it. And like the last year, I was really regretting doing it and was totally burned out. But 90% of it was great. I loved doing both.
That's great. And did you have an aspiration to go into ministry, or were you just an intellectually curious Christian?
Yeah, I did not at all. I mean, that's why the MAR was perfect. It's like cuts like a year off of the MDiv, because you don't do a lot of what the guys preparing for ordination do, and a lot of the curriculum for the MDiv, rightly so, is oriented around OPC ordination or PCA ordination. But it was totally intellectual curiosity and kind of so I did my first year of law school straight through before I started anything else. But it was like a now or never thing of I want to do this. So yeah, it was, and I used a lot of my time to just pursue other curiosities that weren't part of the curriculum.
That's great.
For better or worse.
Yeah, I know how that goes for sure. Well, one of the ways we worked a little bit together was on an article I put out for Mere Orthodoxy.
That's right. Yes.
And what I really enjoyed about it, I like working with lawyers, first of all, whether it's for church or for business writing, because typically they have to think linearly and logically and clearly. And so it's always fun. And so I remember writing that article and some of the feedback you gave me, which I really appreciated. And I think at the end of it, the conclusion was, but Chase, the government has the right to do everything they're doing right now. And it was kind of like this, oh no, like my argument just doesn't matter. Like at the end of the day, I can make all these hems and haws about how I don't like what's happening. But if the government has the right to make all these rules and restrictions on what's going on in society, then you kind of just got to deal with it. And that's where you start getting into the kind of this post-liberal these ideas where it's like, man, is liberalism itself a problem? But that was a pretty big black pill moment for me when you gave me that feedback on that article.
I remember that. Yeah, I really liked the article, but just couldn't have. It wouldn't be my own thoughts. I remember that. I mean, this is. I hope don't let a crisis go to waste. I hope it's a black pilling moment for lots of people. Rethinking the relationship between, well, not just the nature of government, but the relationship between church and state, and a lot of those things, which I think people are.
Yeah.
And I think there's a interest and hunger for it, for a lot of questions that, because, as you say, I would say liberalism has stifled even the inquiry for so
Mm.
long, that a lot of people have not. They're considering these things anew. I mean, well attested to in the tradition, lots of resources there. I mean, it's all basically free and online. I mean, the internet's fantastic, but just has to be investigated. So we're doing some of that, and I think COVID and the past 6 years of political activity and lots of other stuff have been a catalyst for doing that, which is great. And in God's providence, to use it well to think about our convictions and our positions. So not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but I do remember that. I thought I've had many such conversations coming out of that period that I thought were really good, and some of them because of provocative things I've said, some of them just people like yourself thinking about it deeply, which is good. We can all coming out on different sides is no problem.
Sure.
As long as we're doing the work.
It makes it fun for sure.
Yes.
One of the things you try to think deeply on is Puritans, and that's kind of an interest of mine
Mm.
as I'm researching Thomas Hooker and
Mm-hmm.
kind of that first generation of New England Puritans.
Yeah.
I am curious what has piqued your interest. I mean, if I can be honest, I was talking with kind of a guy locally here who's a professor, and he kind of whispered under his breath. He was like, "The Puritans bore me." And I was like,
Yeah.
"Yeah, I get that." And before I
Mm-hmm.
started studying them, I felt similarly. I was like, "It's too esoteric, it's too long,
Mm-hmm.
it's too kind of like 10-point sermons, all this kind of stuff." But once you
Right.
start digging into it, I became really interested in kind of
Yeah.
the way they were approaching building a new society. So I guess the question to you is, what sparked your curiosity with studying the Puritans?
Yeah. So I don't remember why now. I think there was a reason. This would be 5 years ago, at least, maybe more. But for some reason, I ended up reading Perry Miller's two-volume history
Mm,
of New England Puritanism and the New England Mind. So the first, they actually published 14 years apart, and there's some problems that come up from that. But um, the read both of them, and I've never done this with the book before, where as soon as I like finished the last page of both volumes, I immediately turned to the first page of the first one and started over.
oh wow.
And I just thought this was, Perry Miller is the beginning of most conversations about New England Puritanism still, which means you've made a contribution. No one
Hmm.
can kind of ignore him. But he's an interdisciplinary scholar, is kind of the founder of American studies. He's not a theologian. He is a historian in a certain way, but has greater ambitions about defining what America is, something he kind of never finished for various reasons. But his 2 volumes, and he wrote other things. His original book, Orthodoxy in Massachusetts, is also very much worthwhile. But I think his masterpiece is The New England Mind. And the amount I was struck by his prose and his willingness to use the language of the time anytime he was able to, rather than his own paraphrase, which is something I would say Tom Holland does. If you read Tom Holland's histories, he loves to just use the language and quote to kind of string along the narrative. It's very, kind of captivating style. So his prose is great. Historians don't write like him anymore, so it's a readable book. Very detailed in many ways, but it was the amount of stuff he got right. At the time I was reading it, I was really getting into Reformed theology, and was amazed how much this atheist non-theologian was getting right about what they thought and was able to distill it. So that excited me. I mean, I think that would be the beginning of my big time interest. His essay series, The Errand into the Wilderness, is also I would highly recommend. So he just did a ton of work on, at a time, 40s, 50s, 60s, when no one was doing it. And it kind of sparked a renewed interest. A lot of that renewed interest was really bad in the 60s. Some of these things I read, it's amazing they got dissertations, got PhDs for these dissertations. But he changes the discipline. So from there, I just started. I'd already gone through like the Puritan paperback series, phase, Banner of Truth, which is awesome. But if you take that to be Puritanism, the devotional kind of works,
Right.
which are fantastic. I love Thomas Watson and many others besides Richard Sibbes and stuff. But that's not all there is to them. So I think it was Miller that drove me to, especially in their political thought, but many other things, to understand the robust kind of landscape you have with them. And so this has led me to some of the stuff I use my spare time to do now, which is Miller has a very good line in an essay he did on, I can't remember the title of it, but an essay he did on this kind of topic of the Puritans as political theorists and their political thought, and said they were the first politically self-conscious settlers in the New World, meaning they came to do, not for fortune, and not, he distinguishes them, of course, from the Plymouth settlers who are separatists. They come as remainers, we might say in the Brexit terminology, but they're there to establish a society in their own image, what they want it to be. And he says, launch a sort of flank attack on England to show them how it's done. And this is what it could look like. So they always have an eye back. So it's a self-consciously political project, top to bottom. This doesn't make them it's not like they're sellouts, but it's just, they're very aware, and they come with very capable and resourced people for the first time.
Yeah, they're very connected, it seems. I mean, in terms of
very connected, yeah.
The institutions in England, they come over and they're constantly dialoguing. They're sending letters back. I mean, Thomas Hooker, he, at least from what I'm learning, is, he was invited back to the Westminster Assembly, for various reasons didn't go, but instead got books published over in England to kind of represent his case in the assembly. And so there was a correspondence, and there was always kind of this like, they loved England. They did not want to leave, but there was opportunity to do this project in New England, and so they took advantage of that. And the people that came with them were not like non-elite, you could say. They were like, they were well connected with the establishment. And what I love about studying them is it gives me a great appreciation for how I, as a pastor or any Christian, might navigate a lot of kind of tribes. Because back then they also had tribes. Like every society that's ever existed, it has had social networks of people highly connected, whether educated or based on class, whatever it is. And so you had the separatists, the non-separatists, you had the umbrella term Puritan, and you had all these people and different mannerisms and different approaches to reform. And so when you read it, you start going, oh, we're not like the first people that have ever had these thoughts. It's really nice.
Yeah. It's very stabilizing, I always find reading if you're feeling somewhat shaky or hysterical about your current moment, I do one of two things. I either read some Puritan sermons from the period, or I read Augustine's City of God. That will cure any hysteria you have, in my opinion. So it is very stabilizing. It's very grounding in that way, because you realize the human condition is so consistent, and they're dealing with normal nitty-gritty stuff, and they're very aware of that. They realize this is part of building a society and managing one, even where you have like maximum homogeneity, right? Like they agree. They're even all basically from East Anglia. They're from like the same county, and they still have all these certain internal problems. Very peaceful and tranquil compared to the rest of the world at the time, but they still deal with normal stuff, and so that's in a weird way heartening in our fallen position.
For sure. One of the questions I have is that so I'm Baptist. Lord knows where I'll end up by the time I die, but as far as I know, maybe I'm halfway through life, and I'm still Baptist. I was raised Baptist. I'm studying under Michael Haken, who is a Baptist. It looks like that's the path laid out for me. And most of the people, I wrote a book on John Frame's Triperspectivalism. Most of the people I'm listening to are Presbyterian. I believe you're Presbyterian. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
But formerly Baptist.
Oh, you were. Okay.
Grew up Baptist. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of those actually now.
There are.
And so in your conception of Puritan New England, the Paedo-Baptists were in charge. The
Mm.
Congregationalist Paedo-Baptists were in charge. Does Massachusetts have a place for Chase Davis to plant a church, or do I need to go to Rhode Island? What happens to me?
Yeah, so somewhat complicated question, but I think you can boil it down. There's at the official level a general toleration of um, uh, actually out of Plymouth, Thomas Wally will describe it as well-bounded toleration, which means we never want to be accused of persecuting people. That's
Okay.
wrong. That's not
Okay.
Christian.
Okay.
But of course, they have a 17th century understanding of what persecution is,
Mm,
and it's not persecution persecution is like killing you and torturing you and these things. If you break laws and if you are kind of creating, like the Quakers often did, a sort of public spectacle and all these things, it's not persecution to put that down.
mm,
So you do have to realize that. But it's very clear from the record that even in Massachusetts Bay, they're aware of lots of different little pockets of people living out on the frontier, including Anabaptists, including witches, all kinds of things, and they're generally left alone. It's when they come in and try to start demanding, some kind of suffrage
sure.
and inclusion in the process or incorporation of their own churches that it becomes a problem.
Mm,
So the other thing that me and Stephen Wolfe have talked about, who's very knowledgeable about the same period, is Baptists were welcomed with open arms into the churches. You can totally be a member here. You don't have to baptize your children, but you can incorporate your own church officially. Right? So that's the distinction. And they would say this is they're good Christian brothers, but we can't let them, spread their particular doctrine. This is just not how it works. So that would be, there is a place for you, but you have to not make a spectacle of things. You can't publicly go preaching credo stuff,
sure.
and you don't get to incorporate officially your own church. If you want to go worship out in the sticks by yourself, not bothering anybody, that's probably fine. But that's pretty much the lay of the land. That would be it.
That's
And
great.
there's a very hilarious kind of episode with Samuel Ward, who is a mid, he's kind of in between the first and second generation patriarch guy. And the Anabaptists who lived in Charleston for a long time, they knew there was a sect there. They come forward and they're wanting to incorporate a church and, openly kind of do this. And they appeal to this idea of religious liberty publicly, and they start publishing these things. And Samuel Ward just shuts them down and is like, this was never about religious liberty. That's preposterous. We're here to do one thing, which is establish a society according to our stipulations and all these kinds of things. So Perry Miller will cite that even to show like this narrative of New England as being a project. We incorporate this into a form of the American narrative of a bastion of freedom, religious liberty in the modern, Warren Court era understanding
Right.
of it is just incorrect. That's never what they thought they were doing. They were very clear. And I think it's Thomas Jefferson, whatever his last name is, Wertenbaker, something like that, writes a book on the Puritan oligarchy. And he says there was as much toleration in New England at the time as there was in Spain at the same time,
That's
which is
funny.
like an allusion, obviously, to the Inquisitions.
Yeah,
and things.
right.
So he's like, this is just all societies at the time. This is how it is. Doesn't mean there's nothing to talk about afterwards, but the Puritans themselves believed in a sort of progressive revelation by the Holy Spirit through the church, not unlike a particular Catholic doctrine of the same, just without some of maybe the magisterium and those things. But that is what it was at the time. So that it's important to get the narrative correct before you can move forward.
That's great. Well, maybe I would have a place in Roger Williams, Rhode Island.
You would have a place there because everyone would.
Everyone did. He had his own trouble. I think that's one of the most
did.
fascinating things is I finished a book recently on Roger Williams, and I was like, I think Roger Williams has won, like his legacy of kind of religious toleration and liberty is kind of the narrative we've taken. And yet he was the one that was kind of cast out of the camp, so to speak.
Yeah.
And yet he had his own troubles. He has all these groups that rise up in Rhode Island that he even then enlists the guys in Massachusetts. He's like, guys, I need your
Yeah.
help. Like these guys are nuts. And they're
Right.
like,
Yeah.
you made this bed. You got to sleep in it.
Yeah. And I think this is, Corey, doing his PhD at Southern, Corey Higgins, or I may be butchering his last name. It may be Higdons. He's doing his dissertation on. He's brought up similar things at American Reformer. Actually, I thought his article was very good about this exact episode. Like, not that Roger Williams was like an idiot beforehand, a total Pollyanna guy, but bites off maybe more than he can chew, and when he doesn't, he has to figure out how to manage this, right? And it's like, yeah, I mean, basically, he's doing what the Massachusetts Bay guys did before him, which is we want to formulate society the way we want to.
Yeah.
And everyone else who wants to do that can join, but there are limits.
Yeah.
And he's just kind of further down the pike, and he realizes that. So his rhetoric was too strong earlier in the century. And he, as an older man, I think, because obviously he is a good Christian guy. He was a firebrand, and he's a brother in that way. But his original understanding of what society could be is maybe a wet blanket's thrown on it a little bit. So,
yeah, for sure. And he, when I read kind of his story, he was so well connected when he went back to England. He was mentoring people that I was like, wow, he's mentoring people high up in the elite circles of London establishment in England, and yet he goes back to Rhode Island. And so I'd always kind of looked at Roger Williams, and everybody kind of poo-poos on Roger Williams, like, look at this fool.
He's very learned.
He's very smart. He's very intelligent.
And connected. He was a student of Edward Coke's, the greatest jurist at the time, back in England before he came over. So he's very well connected, just like many of these. I mean, it's actually a very even smaller world. Like when you look at them, John Locke is at Oxford being tutored by John Owen. I mean, that's how close your
so crazy
thing is. So it's the world gets really small, but also like really thick the deeper you go into it. And England's such a small country, but he's not a joke.
Yeah,
Roger Williams not, and Perry Miller's work on Roger Williams is great as well. I think he treats him very fairly. He's not a joke, though. I mean, even though he annoys me to death, and I don't care for him, and I would have done exactly what the Massachusetts Bay guys did to him. He is a smart and a capable person, so you have to take him seriously.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to talk about this article you put out for American Reformer. And if my listeners have hung with us thus far on the history, I know this is a bit of a this is fun for me. So, if you're a listener and this isn't fun for you, I kind of apologize, but also I don't, because I love studying this stuff. I think it's really helpful for, if you want to use the phrase, this cultural moment. I just think it can be really illuminating and clarifying and grounding, like Timon said. But you wrote this article, and it touches on a nerve, and the nerve is this concept of Christian nationalism. Now, this isn't the episode to talk about Christian nationalism. I think there's a lot more episodes that I could put out, and Timon is capable of talking about that. It's not that he's not capable. It's more, I just want to limit our discourse, particularly on this article from American Reformer called "Our Distinctly Protestant States," and the subheading is "Secular Utopias They Were Not." I actually had a deacon at my church. He brought up the fact that in South Carolina, they had put in the state constitution, and correct me if I'm wrong, privileges that favored Protestantism, where I think it was you couldn't be an elected official unless you were a member of a Protestant church. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And many such cases in the early state constitutions. It seems to be really the middle colonies are the ones that were a bit laxer and opted for general Christianity, which is still, the scope of general Christianity at the time is very limited. I mean, you got to remember, this is way before Mormonism is established and all these kinds of things, offshoots. So you're still only contemplating the available denominations, but the southern colonies, North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina, and then of course the New England ones are much more forceful about their Protestantism, and will generally, this is even true in New Jersey, a place where there was not a clear or a very loose kind of Anglican establishment at one point, and then all the way up to Massachusetts, where we've already mentioned, that would have had the strongest version and the most lasting. It's established until 1833. All of those colonies will, name check and kind of recognize a general religious liberty for all denominations, which includes, a lot of the outcasts, includes Quakers, Socinians, the previous heretics that would have been treated much worse. But then will, as you mentioned with South Carolina, will limit civil privileges, mainly office holding, to Protestants and to generally Orthodox Protestants. So this excludes Catholics, obviously. And then in many of the state constitutions early on, you see the requirement that public officers, candidates for public office, affirm things like the inerrancy of Scripture, the reality of life after death, the Trinity, the resurrection, the deity of Christ, these kinds of things. Just very basic. We might almost say a Nicene kind of orthodoxy. But then we'll add the qualifier. So New Jersey's Constitution does this, where they have a great article, Chapter 19, on religious liberty of no Christian. So it's already limited to that. Will be, persecuted for their desire to worship a certain way. Great, according to their conscience. The very next article, immediately following up, says, but only, all the civil activity, the people running the government, that's limited to Protestants. So this is the the situation you have at the founding. And again, the middle colonies are somewhat laxer. Maryland has to be, even Maryland, which is a majority Protestant state run by a generally Catholic aristocracy. They have a very bold constitution, even though they don't do the Protestant thing. It's very forceful in terms of Christianity being the requirement for public office and these things. So that's just across the board. That's just how the reality on the ground at the time of the founding. Even as you had the national constitution taking no particular position on these things.
Yeah, and I wonder how much of that should have, if we could go back and do it over again, continued on that legacy. Would that have helped kind of stem the tide? We know that law is instructive, and this whole idea that I used to believe, which is you can't legislate morality. It's like, that's ludicrous. It's not helpful. And instead, like, it's good for societies to have some semblance of godliness in their legislation, and it should be based on God's revealed word. And that's not a bad thing, and it's instructive. It's pedagogical. It teaches people what is good and right and beautiful. And my friends and I have talked about how much should we long or wish or what even gave rise to them when they kind of came time for the Revolution and the founding documents. Why does it seem softer on these matters compared to the states, which would seem to be much less, you could say, just harder on these matters? Just like they're, if you're going to be a public official, you have to be connected with the Protestant. Now, and in art, like, just to clarify, when you say that, and when you read the documents, what they assume is that you go and you belong and you're an active member in a Protestant church. You can't just claim I'm a Protestant, right?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. So several things there. One, all of us, or most of us, certainly myself, at one time would have said the same thing of you can't legislate morality, right? Everyone goes through their libertarian phase. Everyone remembers their first beer, kind of a thing, right? This is you just have to go through it. But for those of us that have moved on from that, you realize that this is by definition what law and policy, if you want to call it that, are. They are a promoter of what society believes is good and a discourager or a shunner of what society believes is bad. The John Stuart Mill kind of vision of eliminating all stigma is not only stupid but impossible. No society does this, and this is something even that I think the critical legal theorists are quite good at, is understanding this basic fact of what law is. So once you realize that, you realize, well, there's choices that have to be made, and then it becomes very interesting to you what choices have been made in the past to lead us to this particular point at various stages. So, in the one thing that I'm trying to do with this article and an article that was like one or two articles before this one at American Reformer, I'm developing some of these ideas. I'm very thankful American Reformer is amenable to it, that are interrelated questions. And one of those that's addressed in both of the articles. Two of the three I've done there is how do we think about what the nation is, morally speaking, and what it was meant to be. And the typical approach is to do one of two things, or maybe both at the same time. It's to look at this particular, I'm going to call this like the conversionist narrative. It's to look at this particular moment as the defining moment, the kind of pinnacle, and from there everything else is downhill. It's all driven by that. So that would be the whether you say 1776 or 1787 when the federal constitution is enacted, or the convention convenes and sign it. One of the two, you're going to make this the pinnacle, and then the thing you do along with that is to pick out of the 50 odd founders, quote unquote. You're not even going to go with 50. You're going to go with like 5 that are like your guys, and we're going to mine their writings for whatever they say must be definitive for the nation and must be representative, and tell us what this is all about. And I think both exercises are not irrelevant, but are not at all definitive. Those are both very important things to do, but they're not definitive whatsoever. What's more interesting is to, by the founder's own directing. So John Jay in Federalist 2 talks about the reason he thinks the nation is ready for the Federalist Constitution that they've enacted in 87 is because they share a history, a culture, a language, a religion, singular, and so on and so forth. This is why it's ripe to be a nation. It's prepared for this. And what that does is direct you back to what precedes those events and what precedes even those men, to understand what the character of the nation is they're kind of surveying, and try to get into that. So this is a much better way to approach, because the history matters, our narrative matters. This is why the 1619 Project exists. They know that.
Right.
They're very interested in the myth. The myth is very important.
Yep.
Doesn't mean the myth is untrue, but the myth is essential. The Romans knew this. The Greeks knew this. Every people should know this. So what I'm trying to do with some of this is say that the state constitutions are, in a certain sense, documented social history. So you're looking at what's like on the ground, how people interact, and this is what's produced out of them. And you have a general consensus of a sort of what I call non-denominational Protestantism that emerges, where there's a high level of agreement across a pretty broad landscape. And what the federal constitution is trying to do is to avoid the wars of religion in the century prior, and say we have Europe has been kind of transposed onto the colonies. The same diversity is there. How do you prevent this from erupting into war because of disagreements? And what we can do is say what the Establishment Clause originally does, which is to protect those establishments as they exist, or lack thereof, and say we'll funnel everything up. And so if the point being, for our purposes, if every state is requiring these kinds of things for office, even today, it's very difficult to jump from obscurity to federal office. You have to kind of go through the process of state involvement and so on, and even more so then because the states are so, even in like the John Adams docudrama on HBO from a long time ago, he talks about Massachusetts being his country, and that really is a good representation of how people thought back then. This was their world. Maybe even their township was their world, right? So it's very localized, very small. And so you funnel this up. And so what do you end up with if every state is requiring at bare minimum a general Christianity, in most cases a Protestantism, in some cases a particular denomination of Protestantism? in Connecticut, Massachusetts, whatever, you end up with the Christian people that are running the country. That's how it's set up. So the federal constitution is not a pluralist one. It's not an indifferent one. It is trying to mediate Christian, mainly Protestant denominational differences.
Okay.
And that's like the ceiling.
Okay.
Right?
So as a
Yeah.
non-denominational pastor, I'm embodying the ethos of the Federalist Papers, and I'm a quintessential American.
You're quintessential American. Yes, you're a Christian nationalist.
Yeah, that has been said. Well, let's talk about that. Let's because a lot of my friends, they hear me kind of joke about, yeah, we're Christian nationalists, whatever, and they think I'm downplaying what I grew up in, which is basically I grew up in a Southern Baptist church culture, where as a child it's very like overlap church and state. You've got 4th of July ceremonies where we're not singing hymns, we're singing songs about America. You've got fireworks, you've got politicians speaking. The best example I can think of is Robert Jeffries in Dallas, which was in my orbit growing up. And so they think that I'm saying like that's who I am, and I'm like, that's not what I'm talking about. What are we talking about when we say Christian nationalism? When you say, whether you joke about it or embrace the term, whatever it is, like how do you help those people come along and really see like that's not a proper manifestation of what I'm talking about here. Hey guys, as I said, that's part 1 of my interview with Timon Cline. If you want to make sure to stay tuned for part 2 of the interview, which will drop in 1 week, you can go find that on Apple Podcasts or anywhere podcasts are found, or on YouTube. And once again, love any partnership you can offer with Patreon. You can click that link in the show notes. But thank you so much for joining me today for this interview with Timon Cline.